think we'll begin now with our final panel of this wonderful conference. Many fabulous papers, enlightening papers. It's been an intellectual feast, to be sure. And in this final panel is titled Pioneering Druze Women. The panel is on the lives and adventures of three extraordinary Druze women spanning the 16th century in Ottoman Lebanon, the 19th century, or the 20th century in Lebanon, and the 20th century in the United States, in Washington, in fact. So it's sure to be, there's certain to be fabulous papers. Now, I'll start by introducing the first speaker, Fikri Cicek, who is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Minnesota and is an early modern historian of the Middle East from transnational and interconnected perspectives. Now, I want to note that the number of Turkish scholars studying the Arab East from the perspective, especially early modern scholars, from the perspective of the Ottoman archives and extensively using the Ottoman archives is vanishingly small. So it's a treat to hear what Fikri has to say today, because it'll be something I promise you haven't heard before. His title today is War and Peace, Sit Nasab, and the Early Modern Druze Matriarchy in Times of Crisis. Thank you, Fikri. The floor is yours.
I would like to express my gratitude to organizers of this remarkable event, and ADF and CCAS, and especially Makram and Coco, and including me in it. And I would like to also honor the Ebu Hussein for his inspiring scholarship and unofficial mentorship that I delved into the ocean of the Druze history. Throughout this event, and three aspects of the Druze history have stood out with me, and it is trans-regional nature and the diversity and dynamism in times of crisis. Today, I would like to contribute this trend by exploring the question how a Levantine Druze household survived without the presence of its patriarch during the periods of dynastic persecution. My answer can be gleaned from my title. So let's begin. During 17th century, Ottoman experienced significant economic, socio-political, military turmoil, both in the capital and provinces. The crisis stemmed from the protracted military campaign, Habsburg in the west, Safavid in the east, and the local insurrections in Anatolia and Syria. The pervasive socio-political economic instability of this period led to the dethronement of the 6th Ottoman Sultan, and the 2 of them were killed as a result of ongoing crisis. From 1580s and the 1610s, House of Man, the Druze family from Mount Lebanon, seized the chance to gain the power during this protracted imperial crisis. They formed alliances with the House of Medici in Italy, House of Habsburg in Spain, and the Kurdish magnates in Kurdistan to rebel against the imperial government and establish autonomous rule over the Mount Lebanon and the key Levantine cities of Beirut, Sidon, and Tripoli. However, their rebellion failed, and they resulted in lasting hostility towards the Man family. During 1611, the arch enemy of the family, Nasuh Pasha, appointed to the Grand Vizierate of the Ottoman, significantly impacted the Druze family. Contemporary records revealed hostility and ambition from the Nasuh Pasha and the governor of Damascus, Hafiz Ahmed Pasha, who misled the Sultan about the House of Man to seize their lucrative territories. In 1613, they fabricated a political scandal accusing the Man family of plotting against the city of Damascus and showing disloyalty in paying his tribute in time and amount, full amount. Sultan responded, sending an army led by Hafiz Ahmed Pasha to encounter these alleged scheme. In summer 1316, House of Man faced an impending dynastic crisis as the Ottoman military and naval forces gathered to challenge the Ma'anid rule in Levant. In the midst of fear and uncertainty, Sitnesep, matriarch of the family, urged her son, Emir Fahreddin, who retreated to the wilderness with his forces, to convene his council in order to strategize a response to anticipated imperial incursion. The Ma'anid Council of the time split it between engaging in a battle or negotiating with the imperial authorities. The Dovish faction suggested the offering the gifts and tributes for an imperial pardon, and the hawkish faction, including Fahreddin, his brother Emir Yunus, and his son Emir Ali, supported defending their territories with their armed forces and fortresses. Emir stressed the importance of defending Ma'anid lands and distrusting the imperial promises due to their broken assurances in the past. And however, Sitnesep's primary matriarchal objective was to ensure safety and the survival of her family's male members for dynastic continuity at any cost. So she appeared to understand the imperial assault on her family was not merely an intimidation tactic aimed at the concessions, but rather a dire and potentially fatal threat to the Ma'an's leadership and its very existential dynastic crisis. Her eldest son, Emir Fahreddin, was the top of the Damascene Governor-General Ahmet Hafız Pasha's most wanted list. A formidable retaliatory forces of 85,000 soldiers and the 4 provincial governors, 14 lords, and at his disposal, including the rival Tripoli household CCAS. At the same time, Ottoman Navy laid siege in the Levantine ports under the Ma'an's control. In the face of this dynastic crisis, House of Man, Sitnesep advised her son, Fahreddin, to seek military support from Christian princes in the West to combat imperial and the local enemies at home. Sitnesep was skeptical to the capability of the existing Ma'anid forces to withstand encouraging the interprovincial Ottoman troops targeting the lands and the ports under the Ma'an family's control, and she insisted her son Emir Fahreddin must achieve a memorable victory against the Turks with the help of Christians. Nonetheless, Ma'anid Council opposed her proposal and insisting their fortified castle manned with armed forces, artillery, and emir presence would ensure loyalty and courage among the soldiers. According to Florentine and the Venetian reports, this sentiment was widespread. And Yunus Ma'an, the brother of Fahreddin, was considered excessively cautious and ill-suited to the lead and resistance. And his son was too young and inexperienced, and despite the hesitation and council's opposition, Fahreddin accepted her mother's risky proposal. And then Emir Fahreddin entrusted Sitnesep with the governing the family's territory, soon to be occupied by the Ottoman forces during his absence. Sitnesep's primary defense strategy, as I argue, aimed to protect the male family members from direct combat with the Ottomans. She focused on safeguarding the Fahreddin's sons, Emir Ali, by sending him the Arab Bedouin camp, and Emir Yunus was assigned to oversee the mercenary soldiers in Deirul Kamer and avoid the combat. The castle commanders were ordered not to admit the Emir Ali and Yunus, thus preventing them from combat and reducing their capture risk. And consequently, all essential engagement will be overseen by the household military lieutenant and other Druze warlords. Following the council, House of Man fortified 2 fortresses, Banyas and Shakif Arnun. Let me show you. Okay, here, Banyas and Shakif Arnun, and the Niha including Niha, stocked provisions and armaments and the supplies for 3 years, and the Sekban mercenary soldiers were paid 2 years' salary in advance. Their family members distributed among the castles for the safety, along with the mercenary soldiers' family, in order to encourage them to fight. Before leaving, Emir Fahrettin urged his family and his commanders to resist any negotiations with the imperial authorities and defend their honor and strongholds at all costs. And he instructed them to disregard any promises made by imperial authorities, even he was captured and used as a bargaining chip to surrender the castle, never surrender. However, Sitnesep's plan was a dynastic survival, aimed to address this council faction, enable the emir's amicable departure from Italy. To satisfy the dovish faction of the council, a distinguished delegation was sent to negotiate aman, or the peace, or the pardon, with the imperial government of the governor of Damascus, Hafiz Ahmed Pasha. Despite offering gifts and money, Pasha stated, quote, "If he stands brimming with gold, neither peace nor imperial pardon will be granted unless the Emir Fahrettin personally appear before his court and submitted to any decision made concerning about him." However, as later events shows, Sitnesep skillfully persuaded the Pasha to accept the peace with Mans and with a smaller sum in comparing the 10 brimming gold with the gold, without requiring her son's presence. During the family's initial diplomatic efforts, Sitnesep advised the Fahrettin to circulate a rumor regarding his intention to personally visit the Sultan at the imperial capital. A rumor regarding his intention, intending to appease him and accepting the limitation of the Ma'anid jurisdictions and the presenting it with luxurious gift, money and goods. Sitnesep's shrewd move played a critical role her son's amicable departure from port of the Sidon, which was under the siege of 10 corvettes of the Ottoman Navy. To depart Italy, Emir landed in Sidon and met the Ottoman admiral and the deputy of the Grand Admiral Mimin Pasha. During the siege of the Port Sidon, Fahrettin maintained his innocence to the admiral and blaming the aggression of the Hafiz Pasha and provided to the admiral provisions and the money for the Ottoman Navy. Emir conveyed his desire to see the Grand Admiral Mehmed Pasha, his deputy admiral in Sidon, and the citing his friendship from the Mehmed Pasha's governor of the Egypt, he aimed to convince Mimi Pasha of his intention to seek the Sultan's pardon through the Grand Admiral's mediation. The contemporary Ottoman records later admitted that Emir were allowed to board his ships under the pretense of seeking a pardon from the imperial authorities. Sitnesep leadership based on a sophisticated strategy, involving deceiving both adversaries and allies to ensure her family's survival during this period of dynastic persecution. In these dire moments, Sitnesep worked by more time to her family by making diplomatic efforts to secret agreements with allies in the imperial government. Eventually, they sought to assault him in the Tuscan court under the Grand Duke Cosimo II, and whose father once allied with the Man family. House of Medici had been dreaming to reclaim the Jerusalem from the Ottomans to establish a Christian kingdom in Levant. In 1606, they made a friendship and protection pact with the House of Man. 7 years later, Emir Fahrettin sought refuge in Italy with his family, hoping to get military support against the Ottomans in return to backing the establishment of a Christian kingdom in Jerusalem. And while Emir and his entourage in Italy, arrived in Italy, Sitnesep stayed behind to defend her family territories. Emir's unexpected flight to Italy in the Western military support caught the Ottomans off guard. In the late October 1313, the Hafiz Pasha besieged the Ma'anid strongholds and targeting the treasures, and the first thought to be reside in the Banyas fortress, and the later, after the unsuccessful siege, he focused on Shakif, Arnon fortresses, where the French gunners bolstered defenses and causing the significant Ottoman losses. The Ma'anid forces anticipated their emir return with the Western forces. In several weeks, Hafiz Ahmed Pasha had to concede defeat and retreating to the Damascus under the pretext of wintering. From the Damascus, Ahmed Pasha tried to persuade the Ma'anid loyalists to commanders with an attractive position, but they remain loyal to the House of Ma'an. However, over time, especially Ma'anid mercenaries, Sekban, defected to the Ottomans, choosing between the tempting offers or the risk of severe punishment rather than remaining loyal to the House of Ma'an. As conflict unfolded in following months, Sitnesep's bold strategy, sending her son to Italy, keeping the male's membership out of combat, proved wise. Despite some victories and extraordinary defending fortresses, many key Druze warlords were killed or captured. After defeating the Ottomans at the first encounter, Ma'anid forces grew confident and confronting the Ottoman army. However, Hafiz Pasha bolstered his rank with the local troops and targeted the vulnerable Ma'anid forces outside castles. As a result, Ma'anid forces suffered considerable losses in multiple encounters with the Hafiz Pasha troops. Sitnesep's multifaceted strategy was alarmingly disregarded by hawkish family members as tension escalated. In essence, they risked the Ma'an's dynastic survival for going to tactical seclusion to defend their ancestral lands. These are the reports from the Venetians in Italian, and I will show you also in Ottomans and different languages about the event and the stories. In the Ma'anid resistance group, Hafiz Ahmed Pasha targeted their ancestral land, the Shuf, enlisting Yusuf Seyfe, Yunus Harfush, and the Druze Sheikh Muzaffar, launched a scorched earth campaign in Shuf, devastating the region through the environmental punishment, slaughtering the inhabitants and defiling hamlets and the trees, obliterating the livelihoods and the torching villages to crush the Shuf's resistance. Witnessing this ruthless destruction, people of Shuf grew desperate for a resolution and urged Emir Yunus to send his mother, Nesep, to negotiate with Hafiz Ahmed Pasha. And they say, interest of the lands of Shuf will be in her hands. And Sitnesep's timely diplomatic intervention came when needed most. With the Emir Yunus troops facing mass distortion, retreating to the mountains, Hussein Seyfe, Pasha of Tripoli, moved to exploit the chaos to eradicate the House of Ma'an influence in the region, causing widespread mayhem. And this painting I created through the artificial intelligence software based on an archival description that I created for my students at the University of Minnesota. It helps me demonstrate the degree of this catastrophic event to the destroying and the burning down to the entire Shuf by the Ottoman troops. And responding to this clamor of the Shuf people, at the age of 70, Sitnesep visited the Hafiz Pasha's camp with her entourage, and they accompanied by an 6 Sheikhul Uqal and the 30 men. Pasha surprised and delighted and showed the respect by welcoming her personally. But Sitnesep introduced herself as the ambassador and the regent of her people in her son's absence, and aiming to negotiate the peace with the Ottoman commander-in-chief, the Hafiz Ahmed Pasha. Sitnesep had to negotiate with someone who previously rejected a peace deal unless the Emir Fahreddin surrendered. And he needed to persuade the other Pashas too, and with the imperial government and the Sultan. This made more difficult by her son's controversial absence, not to mention his search of Western military aid. Against all odds, the persuade the diverse interest group to grant the peace to House of Man, Sitnesep used multi-dimensional diplomatic strategies during the final days of February 1614 on the outskirts of the Shah of Arnon fortress. Firstly, she emphasized unwavering loyalty to the Sultan's authority and distinguishing it from the Sultan Ottoman governmental representatives and preventing the House of Man from, and who prevented the House of Man from submitting their grievances to the Sultan himself. Secondly, he defended the Emir Fahreddin's innocence and portrayed him as a loyal administrator seeking the assistance from the Christian princes to defend the Sultan's royal territory from injustice and perpetrated by the provincial governors. And thirdly, I think rightfully, Sitnesep accused Hafız Ahmet Pasha of committing war crimes with an imperial framework. And she stated the lands of Shuf was the Sultan royal property. And accusing the Pasha of destroying the Sultan's personal properties, disrupting the royal revenues under the Man's supervision, harming loyal subjects, and along with the burning villages, hamlets, gardens, and forests. In fact, Hafız Ahmet Pasha supported the Yusuf Seyfe's violent tactics. After the Sitnesep accusation, he tried to clear his name by sending his steward to stop Yusuf Seyfe's ongoing scourge earth tactics in Shuf region. Hafız Ahmet threatened Yusuf Pasha with that if he didn't stop in burning lands of the Shuf. Yusuf was called planning to burn the Ma'an palace in Deirul Kamer, was forced to pay the large sum and return to the governing city Tripoli. Fourthly, Sitnesep masterfully utilized the politics of Amwal, involved the providing patterns and alliance with the golds, goods, and the gifts, money, goods, and the gifts to the secure favor and political leverage. Political of Amwal played a crucial role in determining the political careers of the provincial and imperial ruling elites, was an essential for establishing networks, alliances, and armed forces within the Ottoman world. And these dynamics required and considering also the welfare of the subordinates and subjects, fostering loyalty through a thriving Amwal sharing system. And often misconstrued as a bribery, Amwal was typically considered the customary and expected, and resentment only arose when the patrons demanded more exploited within the tradition. And thus, Sitnesep employed the Amwal politics and her interaction with Hafız Ahmet Pasha to secure peace agreement, and offering the Hafız Ahmet Pasha a large sum of the goods, and including the horses and others, and to secure acceptance of the Ma'an service. In addition, she presented the 300,000 the crews in cash and silk, half of them designed for the Sublime Port, half of them to the Pasha's army, which is really large sum, is almost equal to the annual tribute of the province of Egypt. In addition, the Sitnesep agreed to relinquish the control of the two seemingly impregnable, the Ma'anid fortress in a month, which the Ottomans failed to capture before. Doing so, she prioritized preservation of her relatives and protection of the Ma'an treasuries by strategically surrounding fortresses, retreating back to Shuf. She managed to preserve the Ma'anid economic resistance to protect the family assets, despite the Ottomans' initial intention to confiscate the whole Ma'anid treasures. By doing so, she prevented the potential exhaustion of the Ma'anid financial, human, and environmental sources within the to the recovery. Finally, I will say, upon the establishment of peace agreement, Hafız Ahmet Pasha held Sitnesep and her entourage and hostage in Damascus, and under the pretext of a minor outstanding debt owned by the family. Seizing the Sitnesep hostage, and Hafız Pasha appeared to aim to three objectives: undermine the Ma'anid resistance and removing her leadership, prevent the Emir Fahreddin from seeking to the external military aid, and to protect Jerusalem and Damascus from the Ma'anid-backed military incursion. In fact, this strategy proved swiftly, and learning her mother's captivity in Damascus, Fahreddin altered his aggressive stance, initially focused on assembling a Western army to gain the power in the Levant, and the more conciliatory policies, acknowledging the impossibility of restoring his power in Syria because Sitnesep, procurer of the Ma'anid power, now she was held heavily fortified castle in Damascus. And Emir Fahrettin informed the officials, quote, "Neither money nor force could liberate my mother from the hands of the Pasha." Sitnesep remained hostage in a year until the unforeseen events that shifted the Ottoman imperial government policy towards the Ma'an family. Nasuh Pasha's unexpected execution altered the imperial dynamics in favor of Ma'ans, and following a year of captivity, new government under the Grand Vizierate of the Mehmed Pasha, long-standing ally of the Ma'ans, previously discussed, appointed a new governor of Damascus, and he released the Sitnesep, agreed to send her to Shuf. And upon her release, captivity, Sitnesep immediately rebuilt her family's power and forces, created an environment obliged the imperial government restored to the Ma'anid rule in the Levant. She did the mission impossible to make the Sultan to issue imperial pardon to her son, someone who was accused conspiring with the Western enemies in taking the city of Jerusalem, and many other fatal charges. Emir Fahrettin did not only receive the imperial pardon, but when he came to govern the lands of the Ma'an, more powerful than ever he left. This was unprecedented in Ottoman history. 5 years later, his departure, Emir returned home. This was Sitnesep's matriarchal victory. However, Sitnesep's role and instigation, duplicity strategy were covered up by her son, who commissioned a Sunni scholar, Khalidi, to chronicle these events in 1612 and 1630. The paper contents, Emir particularly attempted to efface the entire episode of family's pursuit of Western support against the Ottoman rule in the Levant. Khalidi absorbed the Sitnesep and the Emir allegation, orchestrating the execution conspiracy and collide with the West in the empire. So, in conclusion, no one else in the House of Ma'an could have achieved such things that Sitnesep did in the period of crisis. Her reputation was well known among the imperial harem and the ruling elite, which facilitated her ability to persuade the imperial elites to take her seriously and trust her promises surrounding the Ma'anid fortresses and providing a considerable sum of money. Negotiating with a matriarch, an emergent prevalent phenomenon in early modern politics among the Ottoman ruling elites from the mid-17th century. In recent decades, they had witnessed the growing participation of the imperial harem woman in imperial politics, a development known as the Sultanate of Women in contemporary scholarship. Matriarchs of House of Ma'an also utilized the various strategies foster, preserve, and advance their matriarchal interest within the empire. Sitnesep was an integral part and key figure of this era and phenomenon. Her crisis-driven story allows us to consider early modern matriarchy from interconnected and transnational perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Fikri. Our next paper is from Ellen Fleischmann, who is Professor Emerita at the University of Dayton in history, also a graduate of Georgetown, and a visiting scholar at AUB in 2005. She's the author of The Nation and Its New Women, the Palestinian Women's Movement, 1920 to 1948, and many articles on women and gender in the Middle East, and American missionaries' work with women in Lebanon. And she's currently working on a book project about Dr. Nejla Abu Izzeddin, which will be her topic today. The title is Nejla Abu Izzeddin, Unofficial Ambassador from the Arab World to the U.S. And I would like to note that Professor Fleischmann and Fikri Cicek and Makram and yours truly are all veterans of the 2018 Druze conference in Beirut at AUB. So, thank you.
I have many thanks for the Druze for sponsoring, in some ways, my research. So I am very thankful to be here, and especially grateful to the efforts of Makram and Coco for tireless labor on this great affair. And it's been an incredibly exciting conference, I must say, in multiple ways. So in 1954, Dr. Henry Noble McCracken, former president of Vassar College, which is one of the most eminent women's college in the US, or was at that time, called Lebanese Druze scholar Dr. Nejla Abu Azzedine, quote, an ambassador for American goodwill. It was a good year for Abu Azzedine. Her first book, The Arab World, Past, Present, and Future, had just been published. She had hit the lecture circuit, traveling throughout the United States promoting the book, which she had written to explicitly address a Western audience. This was not Abu Azzedine's first ambassadorial speaking tour, however. In fact, McCracken should have said more accurately that Abu Azzedine was an ambassador for Arab goodwill. She got her start in 1945, traveling and lecturing throughout the US as an official representative to America from the Arab Office, which was the newly formed information branch of the newly formed Arab League. She aimed to, quote, give Americans a truer view, end quote, of the region and spread, quote, understanding and goodwill among the people of America and the Near East. Abu Azzedine was uniquely suited to the task. She came from a distinguished Lebanese Druze family which prized female education. Most of her education took place at American institutions in both Lebanon and the US. She received her BA in 1930 at Vassar College and earned a PhD in 1934 at the University of Chicago, the first Arab woman to do so. Her time in American educational institutions and the fact that she felt, quote, quite at home in the United States during the 30 years off and on when she studied, lived, worked, and traveled there, allowed her to build a network of prominent Americans to assist her in furthering deeper understanding of Americans of the Middle East. She developed a rapport with and impressed the American people, prompting widespread admiration. In this paper, I explore Abu Azzedine's relationship with the United States from the 1940s to the 1950s through a focus on her speaking tours and interactions with an unusual group of supporters. I examine how the mutual admiration Abu Azzedine felt toward America shifted to ambivalence and measured criticism. By the time Abu Azzedine returned for her second lecture tour in the 1950s, much had changed, including Abu Azzedine. In the interval, she had written a book that reveals a different, more complicated relationship with America. My sources are newspaper articles, correspondence, archival material, memoirs, Abu Azzedine's short autobiography, which she dictated to her cousin, and her book, the Arab World book. Despite the richness of these materials, there are gaps in coverage, yet what we do have provides an interesting account of how Abu Azzedine was shaped by her experience in America and how she herself attempted to, and maybe succeeded in, shaping Americans' views of the Arab world. Vassar College played a pivotal role in Abu Azzedine's developing confidence to go forth into America determined to change hearts and minds. She excelled in all her courses, happily adapted to college life, and made lifelong friends among prominent families. This is in my way. One of the most important friendships she developed was with Vassar's president, Henry Noble McCracken. This friendship began on the first day she was at Vassar in 1928, when shortly after she arrived, he gave her a tour of the campus. At one point, they stopped and gazed at a stained glass window in the college church that depicted the first woman to receive a PhD. McCracken turned to Abu Azzedine and remarked, "You will become just like her in your country." McCracken was considered one of the foremost liberal American educators of his time. He had taught at the Syrian Protestant College in Beirut, which we all know is AUB, in the early 1900s, and was a committed internationalist and pacifist who was involved in numerous organizations that promoted these interests. When he became president of Vassar, he made it his personal mission as president to make Vassar students citizens of the world, emphasizing international learning by increasing the number of teachers of foreign origin, the number of foreign students, and the number of courses on international subjects. McCracken took Abu Azzedine under his wing. He called her a, quote, very warm friend. From 1931, after she graduated from Vassar, went on to graduate school, and into the 1950s, Abu Azzedine and McCracken corresponded, met at Vassar events, and visits at his home. He encouraged Abu Azzedine in her scholarship at the University of Chicago, wrote her letters of introduction to colleagues and scholars when she went abroad for research, attended her speaking engagements, and acted as mentor and sounding board. Vassar was very generous to her, providing 3 grants for her graduate work at the University of Chicago. Vassar was Abu Azzedine's, quote, idea of heaven, end quote, she wrote to McCracken in 1939. If the whole world was made of units like Vassar, there would be no war but peace and happiness. I should be quite satisfied to live in such a heaven forever. President McCracken's friendship and her Vassar experience were pillars of support throughout her life. And I want to just extrapolate here. One of her nieces called her a nerd, an academic nerd. So she was, very happy at Vassar. In 1945, Abu Azzedine was appointed to the Arab League's Information Office in Washington, D.C. The League established offices in Washington, London, and Jerusalem in order to, according to the Arab Office's constitution, give, quote, the American and English-speaking public accurate information and correct views about the Arab world, and thus improving Anglo-American and Arab-American relations. Abu Azzedine was appointed because she was considered the best educated, the most familiar with the United States, and the most articulate of a cohort of young Arab intellectuals who formed the nucleus of the newly formed bureaus. Officials were chosen because their Anglo-Saxon education made them socially acceptable and presentable in the capitals where they would work, rendering them effective spokesmen for the Arab cause. When Abu Azzedine traveled back to New York from Beirut in May 1945 to take up her new post, one of the first things she did was to ask McCracken if they could meet about her new appointment and, quote, talk it over at length, end quote. She then set to work preparing and delivering lectures. She also started assiduously seeking out university professors, specialists, and organizations to obtain advice, support, and speaking engagements. One person she consulted was William Ernest Hocking. Hocking, at the time, a recently retired professor of philosophy at Harvard University, was no armchair don, but rather a firm internationalist and an engaged philosopher actively involved with organizations that work toward intercultural understanding, and especially those that were involved with social and political problems in the Middle East. And at this time, he was extremely prominent in his field. His interest stemmed from a sabbatical he took to the Middle East in 1928 to study the workings of the mandates after the First World War. While in Palestine, what he saw altered his outlook from being, as he put it, strongly disposed in favor of Zionism to anti-Zionist. It's not clear how Hocking and Abu Azzedine met, but it's likely that her wide range of contacts through her Vassar network was a link. In January 1946, the two met and deliberated about the situation in Palestine, his, quote, line of thought, end quote, and strategies for her forthcoming lectures. Hocking became her strong supporter and endorsed her to others in his internationalist circles. He introduced her to the renowned author Pearl Buck, who was the author of a very well-known book called The Good Earth in the 1930s, I think, who, along with her husband, the influential publisher Richard Walsh, had, quote, quoting them, the friendliest feelings toward her and her work, and actively worked to find opportunities for her lectures. Buck wrote enthusiastically to Hocking about her meeting with Abu Azzedine. Miss Azzedine made a good impression on everyone. We've been trying to find engagements for her, but without much success. Buck expressed regrets about the difficulties, noting that they stemmed from the fact that pro-Zionists were, quote, highly organized, whereas non-Zionists were not. It is too bad, Buck continued. For she has a point of view which should be presented, but people will not take what they don't know enough to want, end quote. Buck was renowned for causing a furor when she criticized and broke with her missionary past in China in a speech in New York in 1932. She and Walsh subsequently founded the East and West Association, an educational and intercultural organization that reflected Buck's and Walsh's critical anti-imperialist and anti-racist stances. Hawking, who was on the advisory board of the association, and Buck were part of a community of prominent internationalists who developed critical perspectives toward United States culture and politics during this period, the post-war period. These interactions demonstrate how Abu Azzedine assiduously followed up contacts and made the rounds, courting support among critical internationalists and prominent people. In fact, you could say she was cultivating wasta. She was successful in gaining sponsorships in her teaching or speaking tours with respected organizations such as the American Association of University Women, the League of Women Voters, the Organization of Business and Professional Women, and local foreign policy associations, amongst many other groups. From 1945 to 1947, Abu Azzedine lectured across the United States and Canada. She focused on two messages, tailoring them to her audience. The first and foremost concern of the Arab Office was the Palestine issue. In late 1945, the Anglo-American Commission was established to investigate conditions in Palestine and make recommendations for a solution to the mounting conflict. A major point of contention was its recommendation to allow 100,000 Jewish refugees into Palestine. Abu Azzedine was attuned to American post-war sympathy for the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. She repeatedly emphasized that the Arabs would accept a share of refugees into Palestine if the rest of the world would do the same. Their opposition to unrestricted Jewish immigration to Palestine was an anti-Zionist, not an anti-Jewish position, she maintained. Certainly as Semites, she stated, we would not be anti-Semitic. Her second message was to, quote, and this has quotes all throughout it, so I won't bother, quoting everyone with quotes. Her second message was to give Americans a truer view of the Arabs and to interpret for Americans the Arab character, which actually is a quote of McCracken, who put it at one of her Vassar talks when he introduced her. Abu Azzedine sought to humanize the Arabs, focusing on positive qualities that would appeal to an American audience, such as their, quote, having little race or religious prejudice. She emphasized Arab admiration for the United States' traditional policy of justice and freedom. She engaged in flattery, stating, Arabia looks primarily to the US as a country from whom the ancient can learn to understand the modern civilization. Although the Palestine issue may have been a hard sell to the post-World War II American public, the response to Abu Azzedine herself was enthusiastic, according to the press, which tended to focus on her personal qualities. The Grand Forks, Iowa, somewhere in the Midwest, Herald, reporting on a speech before the AAUW, declared that, quote, pictures of what the Arabian woman probably was like were hastily revised, end quote, due to Abu Azzedine's charming speech and appearance. Much note was taken of her being a member of a long famous Arab Druze family, which exercised leadership in their country for nearly 500 years and had a reputation for learning and high integrity. Her pioneering academic credentials were reported on admiringly, particular note taken for her being the first Arab woman to earn a PhD and the first Arab woman professor in the Near East. She was also credited with contributing much toward the promotion of understanding and goodwill among the people of America and the Near East. In short, Abu Azzedine made a good impression on her 1946-1947 lecture circuit. She knew how to befriend Americans. She had many American friends. She even had the occasion to charm Eleanor Roosevelt when she and the Dean of Vassar had lunch with Roosevelt at her family home on the Hudson River. By all evidence, she was a perfect ambassador for Arab goodwill. When she returned in 1954, her second speaking tour seemed auspicious. Her book was the January selection for the History Book Club Review. Hawking, who had written the foreword to her book, once again helped to facilitate speaking engagements for her. She went on an extended multi-city lecture tour under the auspices of the American Friends of the Middle East, which Hawking was on the National Council of, and she was, again, well received by audiences. And McCracken, now retired, continued to give her glowing endorsements. And Vassar welcomed her home by hosting numerous talks and putting her up when she was near Poughkeepsie, which is near New York City. Much had happened in the intervening years, however. For one thing, her nemesis, the pro-Zionist movement, had her on their radar screen and were certainly not charmed. The executive director of the American Zionist Council sent out a memo to his members entitled, in Trumpian fashion, all capitals, "Alert, traveling Arab propagandist." The memo demonstrates how seriously they took her and constitutes a rather backhanded compliment on her effectiveness in reaching Americans, as it warns, quote, "If Dr. Izzadeen speaks as well as she writes, she could very well turn out to be the most formidable weapon yet introduced from the arsenal of Arab propaganda. Do whatever is necessary to counteract the effects of her talks. Her book is perhaps the most eloquent rationale in its field of the status quo in the Arab world. It is all the more effective because Dr. Izzadeen does make some gestures towards the goals of progress and reform." But perhaps more importantly, the global situation had undergone dramatic transformations from the warm glow of post-World War II pro-Americanism. From the perspective of Abu Izzadeen and the Arab world, the loss of Palestine and the Nakba that followed in 1948 had changed their image of the, quoting her, "trusted and loved United States," end quote, to the formerly looked upon champion of freedom, end quote. Of course, disillusion with the United States was widespread in the global South due to the intensification of the Cold War and anti-colonial upheavals. In her book, can you hear me? 'Cause it's, okay. Described as outstanding by the Vassar Quarterly, not surprisingly, Abu Izzadeen admonishes the United States for, quote, "utterly disregarding Arab rights in their own country, for producing, quote, bitter disillusion with American action as contrasted with what many Arabs had come to believe as American principles," end quote, and, quote, "the vilification, abuse, and hostility of the American liberal press toward everything Arab." She decries the hypocrisy of the American liberal press towards everything Arab. Sorry, she decries the hypocrisy of the Arabs being asked during World War II to fight for liberty elsewhere when they were denied liberty in their own countries. But there are vestiges of lingering admiration and belief in America where Abu Izzadeen invokes the American Revolution, sadly noting how America in her recent relations with the Arabs has departed with grievous consequences from the heritage of the Pilgrim Fathers and the founders of the Great Republic. On the final page of her book, she makes a plea for East and West to meet and solve the problems in the Arab world through the discovery of the kindred, the good, and the strong in each other's culture. Something seems to have shifted for Abu Izzadeen. Her disenchantment with the United States and the West surely reflected the shifting allegiances of the period, as caused by the tumultuous and momentous changes the Arab world experienced in the 1950s. There are too many for me to enumerate here, but one that would become of major interest to Abu Izzadeen was the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser, which became the subject of her second book. At some point, also, I don't know when exactly, she became an ardent Nasserist and pan-Arabist. An interesting letter which Abu Izzadeen wrote to Hawking from Beirut in November 1958, 4 years after her book tour, presents a puzzle regarding her relationship to one of her key American advocates. I'm going to try to paraphrase here. She wrote this, she basically was planning another book, and she wanted to get from him, which turned out to be her book on Nasser, called Nasser of the Arabs, an Arab Assessment. And she wanted to plan more lecture tours in the US and Northern Europe to arouse interest in the book. And she was asking Hawking to provide introductions to intellectual circles in Europe and professors. What's interesting is that Hawking did not respond to her letter, and at the top of the letter, which is in archives, is a typed note that says tersely, "Not answered, request not justified." This raises obvious questions. Why was the request considered unjustified? Was there a break between them? And if so, what was the cause? It's hard to fathom, as their correspondence in 1954 was warm and personal. Hawking even invited Abu Azzedine to visit him in his retirement home in New Hampshire, where he was taking care of his invalid wife. Abu Azzedine's criticism of the United States in her book was clearly not an issue. Hawking was still a friend of the Arabs and anti-Zionist. In 1959, he wrote a letter to an AFME colleague defending a recent speech of Nasser's that apparently had aroused criticism from UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. I bring this whole incident up as I'm wondering if the letter signifies that her support among some of her champions may have cooled, contributing to her own cooling in her esteem for the United States. To my knowledge, Abu Azzedine never returned to the United States for a third lecture tour anytime after 1954. She spent the last half of her long life, she was born in 1907 and died in 2008, based in Beirut, where she was a founding member of the Institute for Palestine Studies until the end of her life, pretty much. In the interstices of her life, she taught in Baghdad during World War II, helped fund and directed female education, female education in Kuwait, and she went on to publish her third and last book, a scholarly monograph based on her dissertation about the Druze, 50 years after she completed her PhD. There's a long backstory to this. Abu Azzedine continued to be an ambassador of goodwill despite her disenchantment with American politics. In 1965, she took Vassar's emeritus president, who was on a visit to AUB when she was in Beirut, for an alumni event. And her love affair with Vassar, indeed with Americans, never ended. She continued to maintain American friendships and corresponded with Vassar friends and the alumni office itself up until she was 98 years old. In a letter to Vassar, friend Betty Bliss, dated 1990, she writes, holding a postcard in her hand as she does so, "I can hardly take my eyes off our beloved main building. I still have the picture of the library where I spent so many happy hours. There is so much to be proud of in connection with Vassar." I end this paper with unanswered questions, and I don't have a major theoretical argument here. But one thing is very clear. Nejla Abu Azzedine was an extraordinary woman who lived an exceptional life, who needs to be known. In 1932, Abu Azzedine wrote to McCracken, "My stay in America has opened up a new world for me." She was a woman who lived her life with openness toward the world and played her own, perhaps quiet part on the global stage in opening up American eyes to the Arab world. Thank you.
Now for our final paper. Of course, Makram quite obviously needs no introduction, but for that reason, I'm going to give him one anyway. And I want to say a couple things, actually. I think that Dr. Makram Rabah, I've known since he was an undergraduate at AUB. And even then, he was a walking encyclopedia of Lebanese history and politics. And there's something about AUB, the Department of History and Archeology, and in earning an MA there, it's equivalent to a PhD anywhere else because of the amount of work that is expected and the detail of the research and the scrutiny that one receives from our beloved former professors and friends. And so I want to mention Makram's publications here. His master's thesis, A Campus at War, Student Politics at the American University of Beirut, 1967 and 1975 was his MA thesis. And I recommend this most highly. And then his more recent book, Conflict on Mount Lebanon, The Druze, the Maronites, and Collective Memory. And it's his very recent Arabic personal translation of the same book. These are books that I recommend most highly for anyone who's interested in the period of the 80s and the war in the mountain, and these are, in my estimation, definitive works of this period of time. So considering the discussions, the heated discussions that we were having earlier today, I can't recommend these books highly enough. And of course, we all are aware of Makram's miraculous abilities as an organizer. So thank you, Makram, once again. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. This conference should have been, or my late mentor should have been with us at this conference, but he was in a way kidnapped by death, like all of us will eventually be. However, I think we should remember that although many Druze are studying the Druze, many of the good works have been done by non-Druze, and particularly two of my mentors, Abdurrahim Abu Hussein and Kamal Salibi. Sometimes we assume that they've done this just because they like the Druze, but many of their works do criticize the Druze, and I think that we should always be open to criticism, and this is something that this conference has done. In a nutshell, I find that Lebanon itself is living in a completely false economy, and the time for a crisis must be near at hand. They manufacture almost nothing and import everything. The country's money, instead of going for essentials, goes for flashy cars, fine wines, and other luxury items. Politically, the country's leaders are very corrupt, fattening their pocket at the expense of their people, make fun of things American, yet it's a mark of distinction to claim that something they possess was made in America. Frankly, I am in love with this country, but my love was an ambivalent one. These words of frustration were not uttered by a Lebanese in the last few years or after the August 4 Beirut explosion, which drove many to finally decide to leave Lebanon, their motherland, looking for safety and peace of mind, but rather in the summer of 1949, by the protagonist of my paper today, Salwa, Lucky, Shughair, or Roosevelt. Salwa's sober words echoed in a letter to her history professor at Vassar College, the renowned Evelyn Clark, as she was predicting the downfall of a country which she immensely enjoyed and benefited from the unfathomed hospitality of her relatives and endless summer outings and banquets. Yet, for Salwa, despite the beauty and all the jubilee of living in and visiting the Switzerland of the Middle East, something was simply not right. There was an ominous feeling that this Levantine paradise was on its way to becoming a curse to its people. And in 1964, during a visit with her husband, she later remarked in her memoirs, Keepers of the Gate, Soon the collective memory will be unable to recall that delightful other Lebanon. No one will believe it existed. It will slip into the realm of fantasy. The land of my ancestors and their way of life is finished. And if war and religious strife can destroy that ancient country, then none of us should be overly complacent. The lesson of Lebanon is how precarious civilization can be. Strangely, on both of these occasions, the political context at the time did not warrant any real negative forecast, as the country, at least according to the ruling establishment and the business consortium they represented, was going through its golden years, and the country was one which was a model for liberal economy and pluralism, or so it seemed. My talk today will tell the story of one of the Arab American and Druze community's trailblazing figure, a woman who was able to seamlessly integrate into a male-dominated landscape at the time and into one of the most reputable political families, the Roosevelts, and later into the DC social and political landscape. In 2012, while I was pursuing my PhD right here on the hilltop, I attended the Renee Mawad Foundation annual gala dinner, an event which brought together many Lebanese Americans and many of the American political figures the Lebanese called friends. Amongst the people honored at the gala was a very elegant and a dignified woman who took to the pulpit to receive her award and to thank the foundation and the people present. Speaking in her southern accent and wearing a dress pinning a brooch, Salwa Lucky Roosevelt was identified in the program as the longest-serving former chief of protocol under the Reagan administration, a Lebanese American who was married to Archibald Roosevelt, grandson of former US President Teddy Roosevelt. Little did I know that Miss Roosevelt, born Salwa Shair, was not only Lebanese, but was also a Druze from the village of Arsoun in the mountain region of Mount Lebanon, something which got me more interested in deciphering who was this woman and how did she end up marrying into one of the most iconic American families. And above all, how did this Druze come to become chief of protocol for Ronald Reagan during a time that the Druze and the Maronites were fighting a vicious civil war, a topic which at the time was a subject of my PhD dissertation. Born in 1929, at the start of the Great Depression, and ironically, I wanted to meet Salwa. I reached out to someone. Salwa is 94 today, and Salwa was somewhere vacationing in the Caribbean, just so you know. Born in 1929, at the start of the Great Depression to Salim and Najla Shair, Salwa was raised in Kingsport, Tennessee, where her father, like many of her countrymen, had immigrated at the turn of the century and worked as a peddler before opening up a dry goods store, after which he briefly returned to his village of Arsoun and married his wife Najla, which gave him two daughters, Salwa and Khalida. Salwa's hardworking, exceptionally good and kindly father was fully immersed in his business and left the raising of the children naturally to his wife, Najla, a strong woman which Salwa made sure to recognize as being of a better breed from her father's peasant origin. Salwa's relationship with his mother was instrumental in anchoring her character and putting her on the right track to becoming the person she became. This is vividly clear from the way Salwa talks about her in her memoirs, as well as a long interview she gave for the Frontline Diplomacy Oral History projects, which all US diplomats had to do after they retire. As a second-generation American, Salwa clearly identified with her southern roots, as she was proud of growing up in Kingsport, which was 100 miles away from Knoxville, where the community accepted her family of immigrants and made them feel welcome. The fact that Salwa and her sisters were brought up as Methodists made their integration even smoother. While Salwa's religious upbringing was Protestant, something which she professes was common among parents at the time, like many of the Druze immigrant families, her membership of the Druze seems to be that of a cultural and social affiliation. Yet, at the same time, one forcefully notices her immense pride in belonging to the Druze tribe. They, and she's mentioning here her parents, were Druze, a religious sect which was an outgrowth of Islam and took hold in the Lebanese mountains in the 11th century. The Druze feudal lords were the aristocracy of Lebanon in the 18th century. They had a tradition of strong, independent-minded women, as my husband noted even before we were married. And unlike other Muslim sects, did not permit polygamy. They opened the country to Western ideas and brought the Maronite Christians from Syria as farmers and servants. Over the next 2 centuries, the Maronites became the dominant religious group of Lebanon, and the Druze were reduced to a minority, albeit an important one. Noticeably, while Salwa does not call herself a Druze, but rather refers to her parents as one, as normally would a second-generation American, she nevertheless adopts the traditional Druze exceptionalism and the collective perception that the Druze community share of being the founding aristocrats of Lebanon, whose kindness allowed the Maronite peasants to move from Syria to modern-day Lebanon. Salwa's adoption of the Lebanese Druze political ethos, or at least that shared by the Jumlati clan, was also very visible, an aspect which I will deal with at a later stage of this talk. Salwa's focus on the role of Druze women is also worthwhile. In a way, is a reflection on herself and her mother, Najla, which played an instrumental role in paving the way for her to become the woman she would become. According to Salwa, her mother's family, also a Shuqair, were of better stock than her father, as she made sure to point out in her memoirs. Remarking that she was particularly fond of her maternal uncle, Najib Bekisher, and quote, who married a Turkish beauty and became the right-hand man to Izzat Pasha, the Sultan's vizier, and had published a Turkish-speaking journal called the Bayam, and was a member of the board of the Young Turks. Like many of his fellow Ottoman Arab intellectuals, Najib Bek later played a leading role in the Arab nationalist movement against the tyranny of the Turks and the cruelty of the infamous Jamal Pasha Saffah, who wanted to send Najib to the gallows, only saved by the intercession of his beautiful Turkish wife. After the entry of King Faisal to Damascus, Najib joined the Arab government until its fall in 1921, and would later on join Amir Shakib al-Islam, Michel Lutfallah, Rashid Rida, Ahsan al-Jabiri, Shukri Quwatli, and many others in founding the Syrian-Palestinian Congress, which lobbied for Arab autonomy against the French and the British mandate. Noticeably, Salwa also underscores that her mother was financially better off, as her grandfather was an early immigrant to Brazil, where he made his fortune, eventually never to return to Lebanon. Salwa clearly acknowledges her mother's role in providing her and her sister with the intellectual and cultural milieu to flourish, and by refusing to allow her children to get bogged down into the ethnic ghetto that some immigrants became caught up in, and by, more importantly, acting as a buffer with her husband, which was always concerned how the Arab and the Druze community viewed the actions of his 2 daughters. Najla, on the other hand, was from another planet. While she got married at the age of 16, she was a strong, independent woman who was educated, spoke English, French, and Arabic, and later picked up Spanish. In her 30s, was elected as president of the Tennessee League of Women Voters, and in all sense of the word, according to Salwa, and here I quote, was an idol of my young life, a totally selfless woman, beautiful both in form and spirit. After her father's death from cancer at a very young age, Salwa's mother went back to university and graduated with honor, second in a class of 750 students, and won the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship and took her master's here at Georgetown and worked towards a PhD in linguistics, which she never got to finish, but spent the remainder of her years teaching at East Tennessee State University. In addition to all the gifts that Salwa's mother gave her, the one which was perhaps the most useful during her career as a director of protocol for President Reagan was how she taught her hospitality, which is an Arab and a Druze trait which came in handy when Salwa had to receive heads of state and monarchs and their elaborate entourage. With the support of her wise and progressive mother, Salwa was set on joining Vassar College, one of the most prestigious all-women colleges at the time and a bastion of liberal arts education, where she was exposed to Cold War debates at the time, which soon, according to her own words, she entered as a liberal for 2 years and then got wise. Coincidentally, Salwa's hankering to enroll in Vassar in 1946 stemmed from the fact that her cousin, Najla Abu Izzuddin, was the first Arab to enter Vassar and later became the first Arab woman to get a PhD. something which drove the young Salwa to work even harder and to get summer jobs and excel in her studies, which allowed her to receive scholarships. Salwa's years granted her entry to the circle of some of the most influential women across the nation, or as she termed it, the WASP aristocracy, becoming friends with Charlotte Curtis, later the op-ed editor of the New York Times, and Harriet Muller, later the Vicomtesse de Roseré, and Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, which Salwa remarks was very kind to her. Later, Jackie, now married to the young Senator John Kennedy, was responsible for Salwa's career breakthrough. And while Jackie did not like the limelight, she nevertheless willingly agreed to give her Vassar classmate one of her first interviews, an act which boosted Salwa's standing as a columnist at the Washington Star. While Salwa acquired her nickname Lucky during the Vassar years for her prowess in playing poker and bridge, her luck would further improve after she met her husband, Archie Bullock Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, which she met in New York as the head of the Near East section of the Voice of America, a cover for Archie, who was there stationed as part of his cover at the Central Intelligence Agency, a master linguist who spoke 15 languages. Archie Jr. was an expert on the Middle East and was first stationed in Beirut and then later in Syria, and a number of other positioning around the world until he retired from the CIA in 1974 to assume the duties of the vice president of Chase Manhattan Bank and director of international relations in its Washington office. Acting as advisor to the bank's CEO, David Rockefeller, Archie would join his boss on all trips to the Middle East, an area which he knew intimately and championed its people's causes as one of the most prominent Arabists at the CIA, something which made him undesirable by Henry Kissinger, which systematically purged the CIA and the State Department from most of its Arab sympathizers. Archie and his cousin, the famous Kermit Roosevelt Jr., were part of the United States clandestine operations in Syria and Iraq and Iran, such as the infamous Operation Ajax, which toppled Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. Archie's skill as a spy and his intellectual charm seemed to have helped him win the heart of Salwa and her Druze parents, who were not happy, at least her father, that their daughter was going off the reservation and to marry a non-Druze, a practice which till this day is frowned upon and socially prohibited. Yet, Archie's vast knowledge of the culture and habits of the Arabs, of the Druze, helped him integrate smoothly into his new Kingport Druze family. Salwa's role as a CIA wife, and later the wife of the VP of Chase Manhattan Bank, and moving to DC, opened up the Washington Circle or the floodgates to her and expanded her network of friends and acquaintances, and allowed her to hone her skills to the job that she would be offered to her by the First Lady, Nancy Reagan, who somewhat headhunted her for the position of Chief of Protocol, a position she would hold for the next 7 years until the end of President Reagan's term in office. Lucky's term in office is full of countless and very amusing stories, and others which reflect the vicious world of US foreign policy and the Cold War realpolitik that branded the Reagan administration. Yet, for the purpose of this paper, I will restrict the examples I give to those who involve the visit of former Lebanese Prime Minister Amin Gemayel, whose arrival in Washington came after the infamous War of the Mountains in Lebanon, which saw the Druze and the Maronites, the two founding communities, face off in a bloody confrontation which destroyed the once beautiful mountain, including the village of Salwa, Arsoon, and consequently led to the deaths of thousands and displacement of nearly the entire civilian population of southern Mount Lebanon. Amin Gemayel, Lebanon's 8th post-independence president, was a staunch ally of the United States, which invested heavily in building up the capacity of the Lebanese armed forces by passing Lebanon Emergency Assistance Act of 1983 in the US Congress and by dispatching US servicemen, part of the multinational peacekeeping force. Yet, when Salwa went to Andrews Air Force Base to receive President Gemayel, deep in her mind, she was hosting the son of the leader of the Lebanese Phalangist Party, whose militia was responsible for committing terrible acts of violence against the Druze, including the massacre of Salima, a village next to her hometown in Lebanon. In her memoirs, Salwa clearly recalls how her mind was foggy as she was preparing for Jumail's trip, as she recalled the disturbing letter she had received from her aunt. And this is her aunt speaking. "I am suffering a lot with the children and Najib," which is her husband, "to make them forget the horrible day we left Arsoon, the horror and destiny we faced, and all of us begged Sitti, my grandmother, to come with us. But she insisted with all her poise to remain at home to keep it safe. She suffered a lot during her escape to a Christian friend, after which days, Shaukat," and here it's calling out Shaukat Sher, the head of the Shu'air clan with the Syrian soldiers, rescued her. She tells stories and stories of barbarianism she saw. "My grandmother died some 6 months later of a heart attack attributed to largely the strain of her ordeal." And here she quotes also, "Poor Lebanon." The letter continued, "Lebanon that used to be capped with the white snow and be washed with the blue of the Mediterranean is now capped with the black of mourning and watered with blood of innocent people." In Salima, 140 houses out of 160 that belonged to the Druze were razed to the ground after the phalangists killed the old, dragged the elderly in the village square, stripped all Druze women, and all of this. As for the Arsoon, like all other villages where Druze have fed, sheltered, and defended Christians to the very last moment, Druze houses were attacked, robbed, burned. Not a single Druze house was spared, and those of the Shuqairs were burned and demolished by these same Christians. Arsoon today is a deserted village. Despite the resentment of Salwa Harbor towards the enemies of the Druze, the phalangists, and not the Christians as a whole, by the way, because she makes a clear point to the Kata'ib, not to the Christians or the Maronites. She exercised her ambassadorial duties the second day and climbed up the Lebanese presidential plane to greet Jumail, who happened to be accompanied, and here this is interesting, by his own chief of protocol, Salwa's cousin, Abbas Hamiyi, who got a kiss on the cheek in front of an amazed president, which couldn't figure out why Reagan had the Druze working for him. While Salwa made no derogatory remarks on President Jumail's person nor his visit in her memoirs, one has to perhaps presume that she might have lobbied in favor of her own community if she was asked in private. According to one story, I was told on Lucky by a Druze resident of DC, and here I'm referring to Anwar Talha. Where is Anwar? Is he still here? That during the visit of Jumail to the Oval Office, and while he was telling Reagan about the criminality of the Druze against the Maronites, Salwa interrupted Jumail and told Reagan that the Druze were acting in self-defense, that the true aggressors were the Maronites. Such an imagined dialogue could not have indeed taken place, given the sentiment expressed by Salwa. Yet knowing how shrewd and well aware of the red lines of DC politics, it is highly unlikely that Lucky could have called out a foreign dignitary in front of the President of the United States. Nevertheless, Lucky was certainly frustrated from her administration's handling of the Lebanon file, especially after 1982 Israeli invasion, of which the Reagan administration initially supported before dispatching the US Marines, ending in tragedy of the Marine barracks bombing by the precursors of Hezbollah. Lucky was vexed by the fact that her boss, the Secretary of State, George Shultz, was disenchanted by Lebanon, and the swamp of the United States had entered. Consequently, Lucky tried to remedy Shultz's disillusionment by showing him a photo album of her days in Lebanon, including a picture of a relative, a woman who got killed with her unborn baby after the Israeli shells landed in their house in Abediyeh, an attempt to show him that most Lebanese, both Christians and Muslims, were not monsters, but was just ordinary helpless victims of the PLO, the Israelis, the Syrians, and the surrogates. While Salwa did not see herself as a partisan in Lebanon's absurd conflict, she was indeed representing the Jumlati faction, which her family belonged to. Her cousin, the famous Shaukat Sher, the former chief of staff of the Syrian army, and later the military commander of the Druze militia in 1958, was a very important figure within the Druze community, and her village Arsoon was a forefront of the Lebanese civil war in the event which were commonly referred to as the two-year war. Consequently, her defense of her clan was not based on an imagined blood tie, but rather on personal connections of her family, a connection she forged through her mother and from the time she spent in Lebanon, from the collective identity the Druze have tried to maintain over time of being a proud warrior feudal clan that were the founders of modern Lebanon. Lucky might have been born and bred in Tennessee, but her love and devotion for Lebanon and to the community and the faith of her parents was deep-rooted. Equally, her membership to Lebanon and the Druze also stemmed from the American liberal values she was taught as a child, and from the work ethic she observed from her father and her enlightened mother, who labored hard to give their two daughters a chance at the American dream. The story of the Lebanese and the Druze diaspora are not only limited to people like Lucky, nor are they merely stories which one should use to motivate the younger generation, but should be a constant reminder of the potency and power of will and dedication once it's coupled with institutions who evolve over time, while still respecting human dignity and individualism. In a world currently obsessed in wars of identity and where democracy is driven to the edge, the stories of brave women and men, the likes of Lucky, should always remind us of what really matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Makram. We have time for some questions, and then I'd like to ask Joseph Sassoon and Wael Faid and Makram to stay on stage for some concluding remarks. Yes, please.
You want to go first?
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so first, thank you all so much for, your work. Ellen, you have done such a meticulous job at taking us through this history, and I appreciate you documenting this just because it's very important to us and to our community. My question is a little bit to Makram, just in terms of, a little sentiment that you shared at the beginning of your presentation, and I say this to you like colleague to colleague with the absolute utmost respect. When we're talking about criticism that we're facing, I think especially as academics, we are trained to be critical, right? So a presentation without criticism or anything critical is not a presentation in our eyes. So, I just hold that as an evident truth for us in this space that is an academic space. But I also just want to say, you mentioned something about that criticism, and I can speak to the fact that as a Druze person who does Druze scholarship, I experience, as we all do, right? Like, we are a marginalized community, and we experience marginalization on a daily basis, and even in most scholarly spaces, we face marginalization. So I feel like maybe part of what that is coming from that further marginalization. And, when you have Druze scholars in the room like Shadi, who's calling for applied research, and Lama, who's calling for decolonizing Druze studies and Druze research, how do you all, especially, all of the scholars in this room who we've seen present in the last few days, like, that is a tall order, but how do you address that, that dynamic, that very inherent power dynamic, and the fact that we are a marginalized community and we are asking for this research and we're begging for this research to come from, again, this applied research space. And I am also just going to say, I'm going to be very candid, and I apologize. I understand I'm a junior scholar, but, y'all are citing people who, let's cite them, okay, but let's also cite some of the Druze scholars. Like, I haven't heard anyone citing Intisar Azam. I haven't heard anyone really citing Sami Suwaid. I haven't heard, aside from Malik, who, was citing some of the Druze scholars. So how are you reckoning with that, given the ways that you're shaping our field, right? Like, you all are really shaping our field. So that's my question.
Well, perhaps I'm one of the Druze who don't believe that we are persecuted. I believe that we used to persecute people, meaning that if you are to adopt what Salwa Sher looks at the Druze, we were the aristocrats. So basically, going back to what you were saying, yes, I think that the Druze are somewhat overrepresented in the field of research because we have a lot of conferences. You just cited Intisar Azam. Intisar's publications were done by the Druze Heritage Foundation, and there's a lot of studies. Unfortunately, many of the academic scholarship has been treated like religion. So the book that Michael showed yesterday, it was a closed-door conference in Oxford where Sheikh Salim Khairuddin invited 100 people, paid their way, everything, but no one got to attend because of simply what happened today at the conference. I think that there's a lot of work there, but the idea is we should come together and we should find funding. Finding funding is by scholars such as us to sit down and write grants. This is something I really know how to do, but we don't have enough time. So by collaborating with the ADF, with Georgetown, with EUB, and ultimately creating chairs, which the religious and the political establishment doesn't like, by the way, because they want this money to go to their political endeavors, is what we should not accept. We should labor to create bases not for Druze scholarship, but rather for Middle Eastern scholarship, and not study us like a minority. We're not a minority except if we act like one. We are, as I said, individuals who have rights based on the US Constitution, on the Lebanese Constitution, and the fact that we are all part of the same human race. And this is how I look at my work. My work is extremely controversial, and none of the political establishment, the Druze and the Maronites, like what I'm doing, but because I know how to navigate this landscape, I've gotten away with it so far. So let's see where we go from there. And eventually, as we mentioned, we are now forming a kind of an alumni of scholars that we will work together for future projects, Druze and non-Druze research.
Hi there. Thank you all for your talk. It was very interesting. I wanted to just start by pre-framing my question by saying that this panel is titled Pioneering Druze Women. And I have to say I take issue with some of the racist and sexist underpinnings of the panel, where the panel is titled Pioneering Druze Women, and you're simply discussing how the palatability of aristocratic and oligarchical women and their proximity to whiteness allowed them to access power. So, I mean, for example, Ellen, you mentioned some of the things that you talk about in your talk are through for example, white saviorist lens when you frame Vassar's role in Nejla's life, or how you see the importance to be known in our community, like Nejla to be known in our community as based in her palatability to Americans, a country that's steeped in colonialism and genocide and white supremacy, which y'all did not talk about in your talks. So my questions are, Ellen, can you clarify what an, quote, ambassador means in your research with regards to colonialism? And Makram, can you talk about how proximity to whiteness aided Salwa in integrating into the US? Thank you.
Well, she actually points this out in her memoirs, that being, although she had like a nose that is a Semitic nose or whatever, and she was darker skinned, the fact that she became part of the WASP aristocracy just helped her a lot. I never claimed that I'm doing subaltern studies. This is not what I was trained in. And the problem is that we don't have enough sources for this. So once we do discover these sources, I'm more than willing to work on this. I'm not in a way saying that what you mentioned isn't right, but based on what we could work with for this conference in particular, this is what we could do. And on the contrary, I think that I did say what you said. My presentation verifies the fact that she was able to integrate because she played the white game, so to speak, and she was able to understand, and because she was smart enough to navigate this world, which I spoke about Reagan. I don't think that Reagan is a Boy Scout when it comes to foreign policy, right? So all of this I do acknowledge, but we as historians, we need archives. So if Fikri had access to the peasant women of Abay rather than to a Buhtari princess, he would have written about it. So it's a matter of resources for us rather than a conviction that we already are pursuing.
I guess I can build upon that too. Nejla Abu Azzedine was an incredibly complicated woman who had all kinds of multiple and multifaceted lives. And I didn't have enough time in a short paper trying to think in terms of how she interacted with and dealt with the United States to really delve into, her own political activities, particularly, I mean, the fact that she was on the, a very strong supporter of the Palestinian cause to the end of her life. She was an ardent Arab nationalist, actually, very strongly so for most of the rest of her life as well, and couldn't really, in a short paper like this, cannot delve into talking about American colonialism, which I assume is a given, I guess. I was trying to make her live through the primary sources I had. And to go to some of the conversations we've had here, remarkably, for a woman who you consider aristocratic, there's very little about her, and when I have talked about her in papers, not many people seem to know much about her. And that was my prime motive and interest in her, because she fascinated me. She, there were some very interesting and questionable aspects to her as well, which I will go into them, even though it might get me in trouble with people. But it's a very complicated trying to write a history of a person who doesn't have a lot of material left behind her. I mean, remarkably, her papers, you would think a scholar such as she was would have a lot of papers, and I have searched high and low for them, and I have also talked to her relatives and such to look for them. So, yeah, I stand accused, I guess, of what you're saying. But I don't ignore those things in my writing and in my formal writing, and ultimately in the book that I'm going to produce. I am here today basically to introduce you to a woman and how she navigated the United States. She was quite crafty about it, and she was very sophisticated in the way that she dealt with the United States. I don't see any kind of savior mentality here, to be quite honest with you, because she knew what she was doing, and she played the game sometimes, I suppose. She cultivated friends in high places because she wanted to talk about the Palestinian cause and get the American people to understand it. That's basically my story, I mean, mostly.
So we have time for 2 brief questions, please.
مساء الخير. It's been a great pleasure to attend this wonderful conference. I would like to extend my deep appreciation to all the organizers and the speakers for giving us this opportunity to think, to learn more, but also to reflect and to introspect. So thank you. Dr. Makram, as a historian focusing on the Middle East and Lebanon, and in light of your conclusions and the narratives you helped dismantling, how do you value the input of the Druze community within Lebanon? What do you think they really brought to the table? And moving forward, in light of the existential crisis that is striking our beloved Lebanon, do you think that they still retain a margin of efficiency in shaping the future of their homeland? Thank you.
Well, definitely, I think that the Druze attachment to their land is not something to dismiss. And the idea is that basically, and this is something that I've tried to work on throughout the work on the Civil War, that despite the fact that the region and the international factor was important, we always had a local agenda, be it a Druze one, a Maronite one, a Sunni one. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to live together because the power sharing formula is not right, and because everyone wants to test and to have a sip of this Kool-Aid. The problem here is ultimately that we cannot survive as Druze or as Maronites or as anyone, and we cannot blame the Palestinians and the Syrians for our problem. Ultimately, what we are experiencing right now is our own fault. مستقبلنا من صنع أيدينا وليس قدر فرض علينا من ظالم. This is Kamal Jumlat. This is Kamal Jumlat. You cannot escape this by talking about minorities or talking about Druze. I am not a scholar on the Druze. I'm a Lebanese who studies the Middle East and Lebanon and the Druze, and any other community whose archive is open to us. Ultimately, I think that all the Lebanese, including the diaspora, know what should be done, but we are not willing to face the elephants in the room, not an elephant, the elephants in the room. Until we do that, I think that our only space for dialogue will be places like Georgetown, because the toxic environment in Lebanon will not allow us to engage in dialogue anymore.
And one final
Yes, thank you.
brief question, please.
I appreciate it. There's a lot of information about the Druze that's not correct. And is there any way we can correct it, Dr. Makram? And second thing, in Lebanon right now, we hear it. Look, Lebanese were not there. It was all done by somebody else. And how can we prevent misinformation to keep our rights there? All we need is our right. We're not asking for more than we deserve, than we work for.
If I may, it's not a matter of correcting the record. It's how we actually debate these so-called facts. I don't really need to agree with you 100%. It's not what kind of history we teach, it's how we teach it. I am someone who doesn't believe that unifying the history textbook is a way forward. It's rather how you teach. And I am someone who has very outspoken political positions on Hezbollah, for example. In class, people who, my students who like Hezbollah are always shocked how I conduct class, simply because I'm a product of the liberal arts education that UB and Georgetown has given me. So I don't mix stuff. I do what I should do, and ultimately I have a point of view, but this doesn't make me cancel you. And ultimately, I think this is a problem that the entire Lebanese population suffer from. And my own personal work on collective memory goes back to the Catholics and the Protestants, the Alawites and the Sunnis and the Shiites. All these are fabricated identities which we use and abuse just for people to stay in power. Ultimately, we should allow for more narratives rather than one narrative, and this is the only way forward. Allah yahfazak. We should maybe give your seats because we're going.
Yeah. I'm leaving.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be very brief. I really just, at the end of this, just wanted to express my gratitude. First and foremost, really to all the speakers. You have done an incredible job in the last day and a half. Absolutely fantastic. I learned a lot. I think what this conference shows that there is a need for more of these academic discussions. And I am extremely excited by this continuing partnership with the ADF. We have done it in the last 9 years, and I hope we can continue it for a very long time. Thank you, Makram, for everything, for all your arrangement and help and supervision. And again, deep thanks to Coco, Tate, Daniel Dirani, and to Anya and Geraldine, who really kept us in line outside there. And last but not least, to all the audience who stayed with us for the last day and a half. Thank you very much all, and hope to see you in the future.
I'm also going to be very brief, and essentially want to thank all the speakers, the organizers, the attendees. We're really humbled by the high level of participation and engagement. We thank you all, but I want to also thank Dr. Sassoon for your partnership. And what can I say about Dana and Coco? I don't know where you're sitting, but thank you so much. Yes, please. And thank you to all the CCAS staff. This wonderful program would not have come together in the way it did without your hard work. And Makram, I really want to thank you for your leadership in putting together this stellar scholarly program. You're truly a treasure, full of knowledge and energy.
Here, here.
And last but not least, I want to thank my fellow ADF board members for their commitment and their support. A special thanks to Amid Qasamani. Can you please stand up? Amid really was the ADF representative in coordinating all the logistics with Dana and Coco. Thank you, Amid. Thank you all, and I really look forward to future events that further the understanding of Druze history and culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Wael. Just quick takeaways. We are always progressing. The good news is the first conference will be published very soon, and this will eventually be published. Hopefully, we'll wait for the final papers to see that. And ultimately, this is not only an occasion to see people that we love and to have coffee and to catch up, but also this is an invitation for debate and dialogue. And this is where I mentioned the idea of al-aql and the idea that we cannot coexist except if we have such controversial issues and we're putting them forth, especially the diaspora. The diaspora element is very important here because it's not only sending money home, but rather reminding everyone that the reason why you are flourishing here is because of great systems, not only because of the education you received either here or back home. Ultimately, what we hope to do, as I said, that this ummah of scholars, so to speak, or jama'ah that we study the Druze, will eventually invite different disciplines, different sources, and introduce things which I personally am not used to using, and ultimately provide funding for future people to come here to Georgetown, to UB, to any other location to get a better training and thus become able to peer review each other. Well, my comments were not for the people in the profession, because I'm someone who accepts peer review all year round, but basically, as I was telling a friend of mine who was criticizing something I said, she was a pharmacist, so I told her, would you accept Zain al-Atet, who is a crook back home, to criticize your work as a pharmacist? She said no. So ultimately, we are willing to engage in dialogue, but ultimately, our final aim is academia and scholarship rather than ideology. With this, I would like to thank everyone, especially the American Druze Foundation, for being as brave as they have always been to pursue knowledge and education. As well, I would like to thank my home here, Georgetown University and the center, and Dr. Sassoon, Coco, Dana, and all the people who worked here. And as we say in our tradition, afdaltu alayna, thank you very much.